Hello guys and welcome back to the 6th episode of my series about Italian presidents, where I don't just talk about the president of the Republic of Italy but also whatever was happening in Italy at the time. Last time we talked about Giuseppe Saragat, the first and only president to be a social democrat. Today we're talking about Giovanni Leone. Leone is unique in many ways. He was a great communicator, compromiser and a top-tier goofball. Unfortunately, he will also fall victim of constant harassment from disingenuous media outlets that eventually led to his resignation. His term was characterized by tragedies caused by the years of lead and constant misrepresentation. Without further ado, let's explain the context behind Leone's presidency. The expression "years of lead" is not new to the series nor my channel. I talked about its beginning under Saragat, who just didn't have a clue about what was going on at the time. It was a period of social tension due to the frequent terrorist attacks done by anarcho-communists and neo-fascists alike. Train stations were blown up, bombs were sent to government facilities, and people were kidnapped. When we look at the events in hindsight, we realize though that these accidents only affected about 1,000 of people. In fact, life went on as usual for all the other millions of Italians throughout the country. What affected people more was the culture. It seemed fashionable at the time to rebel against the establishment that was perceived as out of touch with the people they were ruling, which it was in many ways. However, most protests that came out of that sentiment lacked any kind of real purpose. Of course, this is a generalization. There were plenty of rallies in favor of civil rights, especially the ones hosted by the radicali, who were fighting for feminism and the legalization of divorce and abortions. The main hosts of these rallies were Marco Pannella and Emma Bonino, the latter we already talked about in a previous video. Leone himself acted as a compromiser between the progressives and the ultra-conservatives in several occasions, especially on the topic of divorce in 1971. What made Leone the perfect candidate for the charge of president was his ability to compromise even in the harshest situations, regardless of his views. Another reason for why he was elected was Leone's loyalty towards the party he was part of, the Christian Democratic Party, whose members owed him a favor after they left them hanging at the previous elections 7 years earlier. One thing I particularly like about Leone was his strong sense of responsibility towards the constitution and the institutions he was representing. His devotion was so strong that he would often put his views aside, which is something admirable and too often overlooked. He was rigid in his institutional duties. However, this didn't stop him from having a sense of humor, which made him particularly popular at first. Despite his merits, Leone's presidency is not remembered for its objective efficiency and his honesty, rather for his goofiness and generally wholesome attitude that was mercilessly mocked in the second half of his mandate, not to mention the unbased accusations of corruption. The downfall of Leone was, according to Ugo Lamalfa, secretary of Italy's Republican Party, caused by his eventual fall into the world of corporations. As we will later find out, that is a bit of an oversimplification, but we are here to elaborate, aren't we? Before I say more, let's talk about who Leone was and his contributions before his presidency. Leone was born in 1908 in Naples, where he studied law and even worked at the Nicola's office for a while, to whom he was close friend to. He became union professor in Catania at 28, and by 1933 he had become one of the most respected Italian jurists. He entered politics in 1944 due to the pressure from his father. He joined Democrazia Cristiana and became its city secretary in Naples. In 1946 he was elected into the constituent and in 1948 into the Chamber of Deputies, with an impressive number of preferential votes which will grow exponentially over time. At first they were about 32,000, in 1953 they doubled, and in 1958 quadrupled. Leone was also in charge of 2 transitional cabinets that were set in place by the DC while they sorted out the negotiations for the first few center-left government coalitions. The first time was in 1963 before Moro's first center-left cabinet, and the second time was with Rumor, also a center-left government. In an interview with journalist Pietro Chiara, when Leone was asked about these short-term cabinets, he talked about them very proudly as a testament for his rigorous loyalty to the party. While he was in charge as prime minister, he would also adopt a very low profile, in order to not take advantage of his popularity and to focus on institutional duties. Leone used to share many ideas with former President Gronchi. They were both in favor of the North Atlantic deal, and Leone would succeed Gronchi at the presidency of the Chamber of Deputies from 1955 to 1963. In 1959, Gronchi even considered him to be prime minister back when Fanfani resigned, though he went for Tambroni instead. Regardless of his busy political life, Leone still made lectures in Catania and would even still work as a lawyer. This was for adding some extra digits in the paycheck, since he had a big family to feed, with several children. Despite his lack of political ambition, Leone was deemed by many as the obvious next choice for president after Saragat. Saragat had left Italy while it was dealing not only with the first instances of the Years of Lead, but also with the aftermath of several natural disasters. The DC at first wanted to put Fanfani in charge, though when it became clear that the vast majority of the parliament, including a portion of Democrazia Cristiana itself, would never vote for Fanfani, the DC settled with Leone instead. On the other hand, the left-wing parties wanted to vote for Francesco De Martino, the leader of the Socialists at the time, though they would change their mind later and candidate Nenni instead. After 23 scrutinies, the Liberals, Republicans and Social Democrats eventually gave in and voted for Leone, together with most of the DC. Leone's election was fought vigorously, but as political commentator Vittorio Goresio stated, Leone's victory as president was hardly a surprise. And so, on the 24th of December 1971, Leone became the president of the Republic of Italy. Leone's presidency started off with Colombo's resignation from PM. In 1971, the prime minister was a certain Emilio Colombo, a left-wing member of Democrazia Cristiana. As we know, Leone was from the right-wing part of the DC, therefore Colombo had trouble coming to an agreement with him, and especially the parliament, when it came to the establishment of another cabinet. Since Colombo was becoming a lost cause, Leone then asked Giulio Andreotti to do it. At this point, Andreotti had become one of the most influential politicians in DC, so of course he took the job. Unfortunately, his first ever cabinet didn't win the vote of confidence from the parliament, since it was composed of only Christian Democrats. However, for the first time in Italian history, Leone still allowed the government to proceed even without the parliament's approval. This was not the only innovative thing Leone did in his term. He also called for the first ever early election to be held in 1972. Andreotti's cabinet operated solely for organizing the early election, which was theoretically doable. However, many disliked Leone's action that they deemed unconstitutional. This is disputed to this day. Leone's plan was to create the stage for a new center-right government. Thankfully, the 1972 elections gave him the power to do that. While the DC didn't get any more seats, there was an incredible increase of votes for MSI, Movimento Sociale Italiano, Italy's social movement, which was a right-wing party. Its modern equivalent is Fratelli d'Italia, Brothers of Italy, but let's not get sidetracked. MSI was a force in parliament which was present for a very long time, since the beginning of the Italian Republic, though they never really had a significant role, mostly because they were just as isolated in parliament as the communists. MSI was the only party that didn't actively fight against fascism back in the day, and so many were suspicious of them, not to mention the fact that they were obviously neo-fascist. Therefore, nobody wanted to work with them. This didn't stop them from voting in favor of the second Andreotti cabinet, though without actually being let in. The only non-DC ministers in Andreotti's cabinet were from the Social Democrats and the Liberal Party, another growing party that supported them heavily, whose help was much more appreciated, was the Republican Party. The Republican Party follows Mazzini's ideas of classical liberalism by mostly focusing on civil rights rather than economics. They were a more moderate version of the radicals at the time, only difference being their approach in spreading their beliefs. I want to say a few more things about the MSI. The Italian constitution forbids the creation of fascist parties or any fascist political organization. While that doesn't apply to its modern equivalent, MSI was definitely in a dark gray area when it came to things like this. However, people decided to allow them into parliament anyway. To the surprise of everyone, the left was at the forefront of the campaign for their addition to the parliament, which makes no sense ideologically, but it does for power. You see, a lot of people vote for right-wing parties in Italy. Today it is approximately half of the voter base, and at the time it was even more. The majority of the right-wing voters were moderate, and therefore voted for Democrazia Cristiana. However, there was a small percentage of voters that rarely went above the 8%, which had more radical beliefs. With the ban of MSI, these voters would have voted for the DC, making them an even stronger opponent, and therefore the communists and the socialists allowed them to join. Despite their best effort, the MSI was never able to make alliances with any other party in parliament, since everybody avoided them at all cost. It was so bad that getting voted by the MSI and winning was seen as worse than losing. It was the case when Segni became president or when Tambroni's cabinet won the vote of confidence. The closest thing to an ally the MSI had were the monarchists, which had several parties, the last of which disappeared from the 70s onwards. Due to the new spike of terrorism and the oil crisis, Andreotti will resign in July 1973, allowing the creation of a new cabinet, this time led by center-left DC member Mariano Rumor. Rumor's cabinet was composed of ministers from the Socialist Party, the Social Democratic Party, and even the Republican Party, though the first cabinet was quick to find disagreements on matters regarding economics. Rumor was close to resigning completely just a few months in, and he would have done it if it hadn't been for Leone's encouragement, another example of him acting against his personal interest for the good of the country. He would rebuild his cabinet, this time without the Republicans, and things will go well for another year or so. Moro is in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Andreotti in Defense. Moro took advantage of his position as foreign minister to go one day with Leone to the US, where he met Kissinger. There they talked about the possibility of Moro making a new cabinet in collaboration with the communists, something that started to enter the realm of possibility ever since the moderate Enrico Berlinguer became the leader of the Communist Party and had publicly dissociated from the authoritarian Soviet regime. Kissinger was still hostile to the idea. We are still in the Cold War after all, but Moro didn't care, and so he convinced Leone to ask Rumor to resign, and so Moro formed his fourth cabinet, where he would essentially start working on a center-left transition that would eventually allow the communists into government positions for the first time in almost 40 years. Sadly, that never came to be for several reasons, which will become obvious soon. In January 1976, the Socialists decided to retract their motion of confidence from Moro's fourth cabinet, and so Moro had to make a fifth one, this time not to rule, but to organize a new election. There was just no way around it. As the elections rolled in, the Lockhead scandal took place, which drastically reduced the DC's approval ratings. In this scandal, people like Tagui, Tanassi, Rumor, and Leone were accused of accepting bribes from the American company Lockhead for making the country of Italy buy some of their planes for their military. This was an international scandal involving also German, Dutch, and Japanese politicians, as well as other countries. Italy was not alone in this. Rumor would later be freed of all charges. As for Leone, there was literally nothing that pointed to his involvement in the scandal. However, his name had already become a synonym with slander, thanks to the media, that would make his last 2 years of presidency an absolute nightmare. From the moment Leone came to the Quirinale, he has been hard to love by the institutions. In his opening speech, he figuratively slapped the entire parliament in the face with all their past mistakes. The speech lacked any ethos, making Leone look like an asshole. There were also a few other things that annoyed his colleagues and journalists alike, like when he brought his entire family to live with him in the Quirinale and how he treated the trips to foreign countries as vacations, on the contrary of Luigi Einaudi, whom instead moved to the Quirinale as well, but with a lot of modesty. It was not uncommon for Leone to let himself go by cracking jokes, singing and dancing when he was met with warm hospitality by other leaders, most often from the Middle East, because Italy at the time was trying to get good deals with, these countries for oil and stuff. At first, these were understood as simple personality traits, because at the end of the day, the meetings were rarely ever embarrassing. On the contrary, they often improved foreign relations and popular support. People loved them before 1976, though that support vaporized after the media started to talk shit about him. Among the biggest publishers to slander him between 1976 and 1978 would be The Espresso and Panorama. The former was not new to baseless political accusations, as we saw in the episode about Segni. Another force that contributed to the bullying was the Radical Party with Pannella and Bonino, though unlike the news, the party leaders eventually apologized years after the fact. Not even the parliament took him seriously. In 1975, he sent a message to the parliament showcasing some ideas on a constitutional reform, specifically on the ability of the president of the republic to be re-elected. However, the letter was never actually discussed nor read in parliament. As this was going on, the DC, although divided, was approaching the historical compromise with the communists. At the 1976 elections, the communists had become the second biggest party in the country, and even if Fanfani, Andreotti and Forlani were opposed to it, Moro and Zaccagnini still managed to convince the majority of the party at the 13th Congress that a coalition was now inevitable. Moro was elected party secretary and Andreotti made his third cabinet, which lasted for 2 years, from July 1976 to March 1978, and it was the first cabinet to receive the external approval of the Communist Party. Everything was perfect. All signs were pointing towards a tight collaboration between Moro and Berlinguer, but unfortunately that would be all for nothing. On the 16th of March 1978, Aldo Moro was heading to the parliament to assist Andreotti at the vote of confidence of his fourth cabinet. He was in a car with a driver and 3 bodyguards, but as they were driving there, the car was stopped by a bunch of terrorists from the Red Brigades. They killed everyone in the car except for Moro, whom they pushed into their own car and drove off. Moro was kept prisoner in a secret apartment in Rome for several weeks. The terrorists wanted to release him in exchange for the freedom of a few of their friends in prison. However, none of the parties had any intention of dealing with them. One of the few who wanted to was Leone, who was ready to sign a pardon for the prisoners, but with nobody else beside him, he couldn't do anything about it. After 55 days, Moro was killed and left in the trunk of a car. The murder of his friend, alongside the constant horrendous news coverage where Leone was being blamed for what was happening, was enough for him to give up. He resigned on the 15th of June 1978. He will leave the Quirinale with nobody alongside him to say goodbye to. According to his family, Leone was never the same after the death of Moro. Regardless, they never abandoned him, unlike his colleagues in the DC. On a brighter note, when Leone turned 90 in 1998, he was invited back into the Quirinale, and today he is remembered as he deserves, as a great man, someone that the country didn't deserve at the time. The 70s were a chaotic decade. Nobody was really sure of what was going on with Leone and many other people around him. I don't want to spoil anything, but many of the things that have happened in this episode will make a lot more sense after I talk about Pertini and Cossiga. Unfortunately, not everything will be explained with extreme certainty, Italy. Some of you might find it upsetting, but I feel like that is the best aspect of the history of the Republic of Italy. It is eventful but also very mysterious, leaving some stuff to the imagination and making you want to know more and more. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you want to see more. I will see you in 2 weeks when we will talk about Sandro Pertini, the first socialist president of the Republic of Italy and probably one of the most loved men in the history of the country. Have a good one, guys, and I will see you soon.